All right, everybody, wake up. Hello, it's Thursday afternoon, and I'm Emily Miller. Hi. Hi. So make sure you're at the right panel. We're at Why Industrial IoT Security is really about saving lives. You're in the right place. So just a couple questions, just so I kind of know who you are, and some of you I know, some of you I don't know. How many of you do what you would consider just a traditional information technology, traditional IT? Raise your hand.
Put them up high so we can see them.
Raise them up. How many of you would say that you do more of operational technology? Okay. So who wakes up in the morning of you guys and says, yes, my job makes a difference? Oh, so this is really good. So how many are already part of this group that thinks that what you do saves lives? Okay, so we got it all in
too, right?
I am, absolutely, 100%. So I'm glad you guys are here. It's always interesting when you put your thesis in your title, because we wanted to get you here. This is about why industrial IoT is really about saving lives. We believe that what we're here for, industrial IoT, and I'm going to lump in control systems along with that, we believe that this mission matters. But we want to talk about in this session a couple of things. We want to talk to you about our experiences. Why? Why do we believe that? Number two, we also want to talk about, okay, so we believe that thing, that's awesome. How do we talk about that with the C-suite who may not believe that? Or other fellows that we work with who may not believe that? And then finally, we want to be able to give you guys some practical solutions of what can you do when you walk out of the room today to make the mission matter and to talk to people who don't necessarily understand that. Does that sound good to you?
Yes.
Okay. All right, cool. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. So one of the things I wanted to do is give you a variety of different perspectives. We have what I'm calling, and I think you guys are probably familiar with the term, the ecosystem of cybersecurity. Vendors, you'll be really familiar with this. You always talk about your ecosystem of partners and your channel, and that's great. But as a defender, as an owner-operator, you actually have to look at panoply of the cybersecurity ecosystem. What does that actually look like? So we have software, that's me, I'm not going to be talking about myself, but I do represent software. We have physical devices, that's right there, networks, as well as government. Government, you can also think of that as your organization as well. So that could be a corporation, but we do have John Felker here with the government. So Lori Weigel, she is the VP at Intel. Some interesting things about Lori. She's a green tech pioneer. So Lori, in her previous iteration at Intel, worked on how to use technology to innovate in the green space. And also, something that you may not know about her, she's the owner and director of the Community Horse Sanctuary. So she does rehab and rehome of thoroughbreds. I'm going to get to why I'm talking about this in a second. So also we have Galina Antoya. Probably doesn't need introduction. She's the co-founder of Claroty. I found an old interview in 2011 where Galina mentioned one of her heroes, a personal hero, is an author and an activist named Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She is a Somali Dutch-American feminist activist fighting the oppression of women under fundamentalism. And this really speaks to what inspires Galina. And then finally, for representing the government, we have John Felker, who is, bear with me, it's a long one, the director of the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center with the Department of Homeland Security. I'm going to take a breath after that. So John has had a 30-year career in the Coast Guard, and something else that you may not know about John is he's also on the board of directors for Operation Renewed Hope Foundation to end veteran homelessness. Now, why am I talking about their personal lives? Why am I talking about the things that I found really interesting about their backgrounds? Because this is personal. This matters. The mission matters. What we do, personally and professionally, and I suspect many of you have interests that are beyond just I wake up in the morning, I go to the job, I clock in, and that's it, I'm done. In your day-to-day lives, taking care of your families, taking care of your communities, taking care of your country, we save lives. Now this in particular, talking about control systems and industrial IoT, and I am going to lump them together, we can quibble about that back and forth afterwards. We're talking about the elements of our society that sustain and save lives. And I've mentioned some of the critical infrastructure sectors. This is not all of them here. But this is what we work in. So I really wanted to bring that to bear and make sure you all know that this is personal. What we do is personal, and it interweaves every portion of our lives. So with that, I'm going to move over here. And I'm going to face my little panelist. So we're going to move into what I'm going to call story time. This is where we talk about the personal, what inspires you. So I'm going to start with John. John, I want you to talk about some of your personal experiences, particularly working at the Department of Homeland Security. What is it that to you means we're saving lives?
Thanks, Emily. First of all, let me apologize for wearing a ball cap. I wore this cap for two reasons. Number one, because the lights bother my eyes. And number two, it's got this little logo at the top that nobody knows what it means. If you want to find out about it, come and ask me afterwards. I might tell you. So what we do every day at CISA, a new organization in the government, as you know, the government tends to be alphabet soup of acronyms. Well, we just felt we needed to create a new one. But what we do every day is we focus on cybersecurity. Now, we don't do cybersecurity. We help you do it better. Our job, whether it's our red teamers, and there's a couple of them sitting right here in the room with us, whether it is our control systems experts, and we have three of the top 10 control system experts in the world on our staff, or whether it's the folks that are doing the heavy-duty analytics that help bring this information together so that people can use it to better defend their networks. All those people that are a part of our team are doing something every day that means something. And that's why I'm there. It matters to me that it's going to help not only our national security, but it's going to help right down to the individuals. Some of the information that we share is meant for the big entities. You know, some of this really high-priced intelligence that we manage to get our hands on. And by the way, it doesn't all come from the intelligence community. A lot of it comes from people like you. We have some great partnerships with big and small companies that see things before we do, that allow us to get that information from them and turn that into something that's useful for the broader community. So thanks for that question, Emily. That's what I think about every single day. How does what we do help us to do that mission that really saves lives at the end of the day? And by the way, don't plug your refrigerator into the internet.
So Lori, from your perspective in the world of devices, we kind of understand from the government perspective the mission. What does a device, chip manufacturer have to do with saving lives?
The interesting thing from where we are in the ecosystem is we don't really do this alone. I mean, it's actually similar to what John said. But what we can do because of the scale of and reach of our products is we can put a trusted foundation in place. And so that's really our goal, is to first of all understand what needs to be in that trusted foundation that's built into the components, make sure that that is proliferated across our product lines, because this is a space where we use everything from very, very small and not so capable processors all the way up to the processors in the data center. And so we want some consistency in the security that's delivered in those components. But we can build the best technology in, and it's not going to be useful unless we work with the rest of the ecosystem to make sure that they're taking advantage of that trusted foundation. And that can be companies like our computer maker customers or device maker customers. It can also be the OS vendors who are very, very important in terms of enabling this functionality, again, through the cloud service providers.
So Lori, what does that mean to you personally? So there seems to be a lot of connection that when I've researched you and learned about you and what you do, there seems to be a lot of connection between what you do and chipset manufacturers. And I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into that from the security perspective for devices.
Yeah, so this is, as you mentioned, I worked on environment, and I love doing that because, as you said, it's an opportunity to really make a difference. I feel like security is in the same league. It's a little bit different, but if we can do things to make it very, very simple for manufacturers that maybe don't have a lot of security expertise to build that into their products, so that all of the new devices that are out there are stronger and are less vulnerable, I guess I'm saying the same thing, that does make a difference. And that's something, again, I think the privilege of working at Intel, where we have such a broad reach, is something that's very compelling to me.
Thanks, Lori. So, Galina, what about your perspective, sitting where you are in the networks, but you also have previous experience as an OEM with Siemens?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it was my first days at Siemens when I just became absolutely fascinated with the idea that the world runs on those critical infrastructure networks. And even to this day, compared to the IT security posture, they're way behind. If you think about the impact that a breach of those networks would have, I mean, we can't even compare a data breach and losing information to losing human lives and just the economic impact that might have. So that was just a fascinating domain for me, and personally it resonated because a lot of what we do, on a day-to-day basis has to do with finding evil, right? And I think that as a society, we kind of might think, well, if there's so many attacks on critical infrastructure, why are we not hearing more about that? And it's a different perspective that I personally have, being at some of the front lines of that is, the absence of evidence is not evidence for the absence of the bad guys doing bad things. And I think we have to take that very seriously. The other kind of passion for me was the technology, right? So I've been in technology and cybersecurity my whole life, but it's really when I joined Siemens that I saw the opportunity to make an impact in an area where there were really no other vendors, whereas we've got 3,000 other companies that are doing IT security things. And so for me, that's really what brought it home. Now, in terms of specifically with the technologies and how fast I think the industry has advanced in the last couple of years, that all had to do with the awareness, right? And unfortunately, we have things like NotPetya to thank for the awareness and creating budgets at the C-level. But I think that raised much more awareness even compared to nation-state attacks, because lots of the CISOs that I talked to, they realized that if that could happen to my network when the attack is not targeted, and I'm specifically talking about the accidental spillover of NotPetya into the OT networks, imagine what foreign adversaries can do if they actually want to launch a economic warfare, right, on a vertical. Think about what happens if the top 10 pharmaceutical companies or the food and bev companies in the world get targeted, actually. So that's kind of, that's very personal, because we consume, medicine, we consume food and beverage, and we rely on electricity, and we get on planes and all of that. So it kind of hits home when you think about all the different ways in which those networks could be messed up. So don't think about that. I do all the thinking. Sometimes it's hard to, sleep at night, but don't think about it.
So I'm going to.
But wait a minute.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I want to jump in on that.
Good.
So in this country, we've been obsessed with the electric grid.
Yes.
After Koppel's book, right?
Yeah.
Who in here, who read the book?
I did.
Yeah. What did you think of the book? Right? But there's more than the electric grid. Certainly there's a problem if the electric grid, if we have a problem, if it goes down, and lives could be at stake. But the things that Galina is talking about are the things that could happen every single day, and you might not notice it, and you could get to a point where people are going to die. So I think part of the dialogue in this country needs to be more than just the grid. Certainly the grid is important, but there's other things that we have to think about too.
If there's any press in the room, that's my number one message every time I speak to reporters, right? It is not that easy to bring the grid down. It's so distributed that it's practically impossible. So don't worry about that. Worry about much more practical scenarios of, key components of our economy being under attack, and they're also equally vulnerable.
So this point about the cascading impacts of things beyond just the electric grid, or what kind of gets the major hype in the news. Galina, I'm just going to keep talking on that point, and John, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's exactly what I was going to ask you next.
How did I know that?
Probably because we know each other really well. So Galina, in your experience, everything we're talking about, when we're talking about the mission of saving lives, we're kind of dancing around about, well, this mission is really important personally, but something money. At the C-suite, what is this conversation? Does walking in and saying, I really care about lives and I'm saving the world, does that work? Does that resonate?
Yeah, well, let's be real. It's all about the bottom line. I mean, I think this is why it wasn't so much the nation state attacks that moved the needle, but it was the NotPetya, the bringing down production for a number of hours, number of days. I think that, there were some estimates from the White House about the impact of a couple of those attacks at the range of 10 billion. I think this is just scratching the surface because very few of the companies that actually got impacted reported that. And if you think about the effect that they had on their customers and their suppliers, I mean, there was so much more that got disrupted. So no, it is always absolutely about the money. And in a sense, it was almost like it wasn't a good thing that NotPetya happened, but it was a good thing that the C-level woke up and decided that they need to ask their team basically who is responsible, who from my team is responsible for taking care of those networks, and where is the budget is going to come from. And it's not a hard decision because if you've got $100 to spend, right, and if you could spend $1 on OT networks and actually bring them from 0 security to 90% security versus spending $1 on the fifth endpoint solution that you have in the IT, that just doesn't really compare. So
Well, and that's
There's more to
go
that
ahead.
too. I mean,
Go.
so think about this. Take the grid off the table. Think about the longshoreman strike in LALB a few years ago. What was the economic impact to this country? It was $1 billion plus a day. So all the other players in that port could potentially be impacted, not just the shippers, not just the Maersk, who, by the way, got hammered by NotPetya. What's tied up in a port? It's not just ships and shipping companies, but it's the railroads. It's the trucking lines. It's all the employees that are there. And when that starts to really cascade down, to your point earlier, Emily, then we start having a problem. So how do we get the visibility for that sort of potential cataclysmic event into the C-suite so that they understand that this is something that they have to pay attention to?
Now, what we're talking a lot about right now, and Lori, I moved over here, so I have direct line of sight with you right now. And hi, surprise, I'm over here now. We're talking a lot about OT networks and looking at the network level perspective and the business incentive for protecting the networks. Lori, what's a business incentive or return on investment for looking at devices?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I don't know if the people I met with this morning are here, but I'll share an example that we were talking about in the area of medical equipment. And so a particular device, say an X-ray machine or an MRI machine, if that were compromised and actually caused harm to a person, let's say an X-ray machine killed somebody, there's the impact of that, which is bad enough, but what if that took away the trust, or we had to completely disable a whole, great number of these machines? People couldn't take advantage of that. I mean, there are these ripple effects that happen at the device level as well.
So what I hear you saying is, in addition to a physical impact, which I think you guys have probably heard this, the argument of, that's science fiction and that will never happen. But your point about what will it do to trust?
Trust and also just processes, right? If we know that there is a particular vulnerability in a particular piece of equipment, that's all going to come offline, right? Well, it gets remedied. And so that's another piece of the impact. But the trust piece is also important.
Have you seen direct conversations at the C-suite level about that level of conversation and how that relates to an ROI, or return on investment?
That one, no, not so much. It's much more what Galina was describing in terms of, if a semiconductor manufacturer is hit, as they have been, and production's impacted, it's the billions of dollars lost, or at least millions of dollars lost to production impacts.
So
more
John,
likely.
from your vantage point, I'm really kind of keying in on this conversation about the mission of saving lives, of saving the cascading consequences. That's a lot of C's in one little sentence there. Thinking about how the government interacts with private sector, have you seen a reticence based on a lack of awareness of the actual business impact to talk to the government or to respond to impacts or respond to potential incidents?
Yes and no. And I think case by case. In some instances, we've had great partners in the private sector. I'll talk about some devices, not specifically, but we've had a program for a number of years where researchers, hackers, whatever you want to call them, find vulnerabilities in some of these devices, medical devices in particular. And we have a responsible disclosure process that we go through to help the researcher understand and to help the owner of that device understand, the owner or the builder of that device understand, and then bring them together so that there's a useful discussion instead of finger pointing. And then how do we turn that into something that's useful in the long term? What do we do next? We know there's a vulnerability in X, a pacemaker, for example. How do we get the word out that that pacemaker has to be replaced or patched or whatever, and do it in a way that's that recognizes that there's a potential hit to the stock price when that goes public, that there's a potential hit to the trust of that device and all the doctors that use that device, and how do you, and so that's part of the process that we do. I think one other thing that I think is important that we haven't learned yet, particularly from WannaCry, is this concept that we've got these medical devices, and the FDA requires that the patching be done by the OEM. How many devices can a small team at the FDA monitor, and how many of those builders of those equipment have the teams that can go out and do the regular patching? So we've got to have a discussion about how we do that well too, right? They got hammered. The National Health System in the UK shut down because of WannaCry. That was part of the reason. We had issues here in this country as a result of it. It wasn't as bad because we had done the people who were impacted did some really good job of segmenting their architecture and things like that. But we've got to have that discussion, I think, because it's going to relate directly back to the title of this talk, which is saving lives. If we can't figure out a way to do that better, then we're going to be in a world of hurt.
Yeah.
So Galina, a question for you related to that. How, in your perspective, do we quantify that risk in ways that align this mission to dollars?
Well, I think that for some of the industries, it's much easier than others, right? So especially if you're in manufacturing, any type of production, it's fairly easy to calculate what is a minute of downtime, and you'll be shocked by some of those numbers. I mean, they're just absolutely astronomical. Because it's not just that you're stopping for a minute, right? Especially if you're in the chemical business and you're processing chemicals, sometimes you have to, even if production stops for a minute, you need to spend 3 days actually, getting the process back to the initial state. So I don't know that ROI from a production downtime is the only way in which we'll quantify that. The argument that I use more often is, look, a network is a network. The attacker is not gonna, gonna get routed to the OT SOC if they're attacking the OT network, and routed to the IT SOC if they're going from this direction. So I think the biggest challenge for customers right now is the fact they just don't have visibility into all of those devices, that they're completely a blind spot for them, right? So getting into that visibility kind of evens the playing field a little bit, because if you think back to some of the examples that we have with Triton, for example, right, the attack on the Triconic safety system, the attackers were in the network for months, right? So we're just talking about, as defenders, we need to have a bit of an advantage of how we defend that, and it's actually not that hard. So I go back to my example of take a unit cost of 1, and instead of incrementally investing it in a pretty sophisticated IT SecOps program, invest that into the OT networks and doing something with that. So at least you've got a bit of a chance of defending yourself when that happens.
What do you say to somebody who might be sitting in this room who says, well, that's great, but we don't really have an OT network or process. I'm a consulting company.
We can run that exercise right now. It's like, I think I've run it at RSA for like 3 years in a row. The numbers are getting better, and I think at this point people are scared. But yeah, I run them through that exercise, because it's usually like, the insurance companies and the banks are like, oh my God, thank God that I don't have critical infrastructure. I'm like, wait, do you work in an office? Do you take the elevator up? Do you have like, the fire suppression, the sprinkles? you do have industrial control systems. They are currently invisible to your teams, and you're blind to the risk that is in those networks. So everything, the lights in this room, elevator, transportation, all of that is driven and run by a form of industrial control system. So yeah, and that's actually a very, very attractive attack vector into some of their more sophisticated IT environments, yeah.
So I think that's a really good point, that OT is everywhere. Is that what you're saying? So I think one of the things that was a question when I was building this is all really interesting, but it seems like a lot. We've got device level security, and then we have to think about the individual devices. And then once you have the devices, now you got to think about the network. And then gee whiz, there's the government or your organization asking for metrics and information and threat information, et cetera. How do we make sense of the problem? So Lori, I'm going to start with you.
Good,
What
I'm
are
glad she
some of
was
the
going to start
things-
with me.
Yeah, because I've been picking on both of you for a little bit. Let's just start teasing that out. From a device perspective, let's just tease out, how do we start making sense of all of this?
So I think at least in my experience, your question, first of all, is spot on. A lot of customer conversations that we have, and it's not just in critical infrastructure, but it's kind of across the board. People want a silver bullet. They want to know what's the one thing that I can do and I'm going to be protected. And the reality is it is more complicated than that. From a device perspective, the things that we really advocate are some really core functionality that should be built into the device. You should be able to do a secure boot. It should have some secure storage capability. Maybe it needs a trusted execution environment. It should have identity. So there's some fundamental building blocks that should be built into it. But the most important thing is that as a manufacturer is creating a device, they're really doing security by design, that they're following good practices. Again, we can put those building blocks into the products, but if they're not taking advantage of them for the appropriate threat model for that device, it's not going to be effective. And so it's really those security by design practices that are critical.
Well, that's interesting to think about designing new stuff, but what about legacy devices? What about devices that have been in the field and are going to remain in the field?
And that's where I would turn your complexity, and I hope I don't sound Pollyanna here, but I'm going to kind of try to turn your complexity into an opportunity. Because we have these different tools for security, we can put in compensating controls when we have legacy, as an example. So maybe we need to rely more on the network when the device can't be upgraded. But I would also say, and we'll probably come back to this again, upgradability is really, really critical, and that should absolutely be part of people's purchase criteria. What is the mechanism for keeping things current?
Thanks, Lori. So you started talking about things like authentication, identity. Those sound like really, IT-ish type of things that we're going to apply to an OT network. Is it easy, Galina, to start putting IT-type principles into OT-type environments?
Well, it's not easy, but I wouldn't call them IT principles. It's just principles of how we identify devices and how those devices communicate. So there's no question that legacy devices will be with us for a while, and that's not going to change because when companies like Siemens and Schneider are designing safety systems, for example, you don't want to have to replace those every year. They need to stay out there for like 30, 40 years. So we're going to keep on dealing with the consequences of the legacy systems. But I think that we also have an opportunity to kind of take the same models that have worked in IT and apply those to OT. And one of my frustrations as I started working in OT was, well, people kept on telling me, well, things are so different. You can't do this, you can't do this, you can't touch it. And I'm like, okay, is this a network? It's a network. It's a device, it's a device. The two devices are communicating on the network. Yes, they have proprietary protocols. Yes, they have different identities. Yes, all of that. But it's the same kind of basic concepts, and we can't keep on saying that they're different because, again, to an attacker, a network is a network, an endpoint is an endpoint, and they will take advantage of anything and everything they can. So it is really important that we don't shy away from some of the new concepts. Things like, for example, I don't know if you know this, but some of the vendors have started putting their SCADA and HMI and engineering station software in the cloud. And at first, you know, to like OT engineers, this is like, oh my God, this is the end of the world. It is the end of the world when things are not secure. But if we're now building a new model where we've got the ability to secure that communication, right? Then we have a completely new a completely new model that we're working out of. So we shouldn't be saying no to the new concepts just because of how the old world looks to look like. And again, we need to be very, very careful. I wouldn't put the controllers in the cloud as of yet, but it is coming, I think, much faster than we understand.
So are there any sort of best practices or standards or things that are starting to help people in a very practical way to implement some of these new models that you're talking about?
So I'm going to be a little bit critical of the standards, and I myself helped with some of those standards, but to me the standards are kind of like the Bible, you know, nothing against religion, but it's like, thou shalt not do blah, blah, blah. Well, that's great. I know what I need to do, but the reality is that I only have a team of 5 and, you know, that much money and that much time. So I think that what's important is to figure out what are the 2 or 3 things that you can do, and not just from a technology perspective, but really people, process, technology, that you could implement in your networks that are going to move the needle the most, right? And sometimes this could be technology, sometimes it just could mean, you know, having a better alignment between the teams. A really good way to start is just do an assessment, right? We all know that OT networks are in a really bad shape. Once you do an assessment and you show your management how bad it is, I think that will create some budget money for you to spend, yeah.
So, John, I'm going to hold on you for just a minute. We'll go back to Lori really quickly. We're starting to talk about this new models, and we're dancing around it a little bit. What does that mean for you?
I'm not sure what you're.
Well, we're talking about the new model for the network and the new way of doing things, and when I asked about what can you do with devices, you sort of started to talk about a list of things that you can have in a device and mentioned there's new technologies emerging.
Yeah, okay, yeah, very much so. And some of the things that are really, really interesting from a device perspective are applying machine learning and artificial intelligence so the device can do its own diagnostics. We're doing a lot of really interesting work on that in the PC and server space now, and I think it's something that we have an opportunity to apply in the industrial controls and the more fixed function or deterministic devices to an even greater extent. It turns out our platforms are full of telemetry that you can take these measurements and you can detect things like crypto mining on a device. You can detect side channel attacks. And so we're working, and we've talked about it a little bit here at RSA, on a technology for the industry called threat detection technology that provides this platform for others to build on.
So you're taking the principles that are being used right now in networks and actually applying them before something goes for a serial to Ethernet converter and looking at actually on the device?
Yeah, so the device can detect the problem itself.
That's fascinating. So John, to you, what are some practical things that you're thinking of? We're talking very much in the weeds at this point, and now I know government, you're sitting up here. So what are some of the things that you're seeing?
They do stuff, you know?
Yeah, well, right, I mean, yeah, you do things.
Well,
So-
we do stuff, and the folks that are sitting right here in the front are evidence of that. The way we've been approaching the responsible disclosure process, I think, is a good example of, so at the government level, so what? What do we do? Put people together to talk about, from both sides of the equation, to talk about something that's a vulnerability in a device. I think a lot of work has been done on that in our shop to think about how to do that better, how to get people to come with us and cooperate instead of having their OGC block us every time we want to have a chat with them. And I'll tell you, Marty Edwards is here with us today. It was one of the big reasons that DHS and CISA is as good as we are in the control system space, because Marty led the way in standing up that government capability that helps us understand the community, the people like Galina and Lori, and also helps us develop those relationships so we can have that discussion. I still worry about the biggest thing is this confluence of IT and OT. and the fact that people don't recognize that confluence is a potential attack surface.
Dig into that. What do you mean?
Well, so when I worked at Hewlett Packard, we had a big effort over a period of a couple of years to, I hate to go back to the grid, but it's a great example.
Wait.
To get
Don't focus on the grid, but now we're focusing on the grid.
Yeah.
Okay,
But
go.
I'm using it as an example. So to get the electric companies, not just the big boys, not just the Southerns and the PG&Es and the SoCal Edisons and all that, but some of the ones where it really matters in the Midwest, these mid-size and municipal companies, to understand that, yeah, it's great that you have a business system now where you can measure flow and you can determine the optimal time to do power generation, and you can do billing and you can do all that, and we don't have to have meter readers anymore because your meter is an IP address, and we can get all that data and we can use that data. But guess what? All that stuff brings it into potentially contact with your generation system or your distribution system or your transmission system.
Not potentially, actually.
Yeah, and so how do you think through that so that you can take best advantage of that from a business perspective, but at the same time build the safeguards into the process so you're protecting yourself, and oh, by the way, make bloody well sure that your senior leadership in your organization, whether you're a big company or a small company, understands that this confluence is really important and you have to pay attention to it. So that keeps me up at night, that equation still. And it's not just in the grid. Where are we using business systems to better manage control systems?
So you're saying that business system could have an impact on safety and potentially reliability?
Yeah,
if we're
without
talking
question.
about the
So if
grid?
we go back 2 summers ago, where we did incident response with 5 different private sector critical infrastructure partners. It took us a few weeks to figure out that was all connected, but the part of that was that the attack surface came from business systems into their business systems, and there was probing of control systems. So we think about that constantly, and how do we get other people to think about it in a way that's useful for them, in a way that they can talk to their board about, get the dollars, get the people, get whatever, get an understanding that this is something we really have to focus on.
Now, you're talking a little bit about the business data that they're going to be using from the different nodes in the system, and they're gathering information from that. What about the security or integrity of that data itself? Is that something we need to be concerned about as well?
Yeah.
So do you have any concerns about an actor potentially manipulating data from a headless device?
Yeah, so I think you need to think about it in 2 ways. Manipulating data can cause a couple of different effects. Manipulating data could cause a chemical plant to do a mix wrong or to do a process wrong, which could conceivably have catastrophic impact on that plant. So you have to think about it from that perspective. There's 100 different ways you can think about getting into that do loop and making something bad happen.
So do you think that would be something the C-suite would be interested in, that bad cannot just be a kinetic effect, that it may be manipulation?
Well, absolutely, they will be interested in that. The challenge that we have, and Marty will back me up on this, and I know both Lori and Galina will as well, is how do we make it real to them? How do we make it so that the C-suite and the CEO understand that whatever impact we're talking about is a potential impact to the bottom line, because that's what really matters. I mean, certainly a plant blowing up is bad, and people could die. That's really bad. But in the day-to-day steady state operations, how do we get them to think about it? And how can we talk to them about it in a way that they'll understand? They don't understand ones and zeros. They don't understand. They could care less about your mean time between patches, whatever statistics the IT crowd is wanting to roll out this week. They don't care about that. How do we talk to them about it in a way that we can take all that really great knowledge that the smart folks have that are doing this stuff every day and turn it into something that they can understand and that they can get their hands on and say, oh yeah, damn it, that's right. We got to get something on this. And so turn it into a budget request or a different change of policy and procedure so that it has an effect.
It's a really good place to transition right now. We're just going to do your final thoughts. We've got about 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to do questions over those 10 minutes. So just a little recap, and I think remember what we kind of circled on is our thesis is that this really is about saving lives, and what you do today matters. But to John's point that he just made, getting the Titanic to shift, because the Titanic is really interested in money at this point and bottom line. How do we do that, and what practical steps do you want to give our audience today? So Lori, I'm going to start with you just to take away.
So again, I think the area we would emphasize is have a solid foundation in your own designs and systems, but also in your supply chain management. Make security part of your supply chain program, everything from practicing SDL to core functionality. I think in terms of getting budgets, the thing that seems to work the best for us is the focus on availability. We talked about that already, you know, because and you can point to instances in the environment, in the competitor base, et cetera, where it's made a difference. I think the other thing is showing people, or the senior management at the board level, what you have protected against. So you're establishing credibility in terms of being under attack.
Thanks. Galina?
Yeah, what has worked in my experience is just translating what it means in terms of impact, right? So this is an assessment of your environment. This is what it looks like. These are all the potential attack vectors. This is what it would mean for your production lines to be down. This is how competitors could actually get into manipulating your production formula in a way that's subtle but ends up costing you money down the line. So you have to translate that into whatever business they're in so they can understand the bottom line. Once you do that, it's the money flows because they are business people and they get it that it would have impact on the bottom line.
I can't top that. I don't even want to try. But what I will do is I'll take a little different spin and I'll say, look, we in CISA want to be your partner. Our objective is to help you understand what's going on, and that's the value add to you. We have a lot of resources and a lot of places that we get information. Our job is to synthesize that information and make it available to you to help you do what these two ladies were just talking about in terms of having a conversation with your leadership, understanding what's going on in those networks. So help us help you with that value proposition.
Thanks, guys. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes, and we're going to open it up to questions for you. So I think you can either stand up and shout or come to a mic right here or over there, or you could just stand awkwardly by me and talk into my lapel. That works too.
How you doing? I want to put on my cape and try to be, the hero here, because what I'm about to tell you is about saving lives. We use in our plant to do our frozen foods a system that relies on something called anhydrous ammonia. Have any of you heard of this chemical?
Yeah, it'll kill you.
Oh, yeah.
So, sounds like a lot of you have. Good. So, we've recently done a lot to secure the network on which the monitoring and control systems work in this environment. We've put it behind a firewall with IDS IPS. We've even gone so far as to enable PortSec. You have to use specific MAC addresses to make sure that these IP-enabled devices are only allowed to connect to a single port, so that there also can't be any IP conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. In our particular situation, if for some reason there is a massive release of this chemical, there is a town with a population of about 9,000 people that is in the immediate vicinity and in the general downwind direction of this plant. So as you can imagine, I stress out about this quite frequently. My question to you is what we have done enough? That's not the end of my question. And number two is, if it isn't, who do I talk to help me understand better the entire attack surface of that area of the plant that has been segregated from a network perspective?
Well, I will maybe answer with another question. Based on the technical controls that you currently have in place, if an attacker is on your network, on your OT network, would you know? Do you have a way of knowing? So that's probably the first question to ask yourself.
Yeah, that's a great question, and the true answer is maybe.
Not a good enough
the reason,
answer.
yeah, the reason I say that is because they would have to traverse that firewall somehow in order for us to see it. If they stay inside the network and go from IP to IP, I don't know how I would see it. See what I'm saying?
Right, well, that's not the only way to get into the OT network, right?
Yeah.
You've got vendors and probably contractors that are doing things
Exactly.
physically and remotely on those environments. So
Yep.
being able, I would say, just like in the IT network, starting with the visibility, you need to be able to monitor egress points and what is actually happening, being able to track lateral movement, right? So unless you have that visibility, everything else is kind of a moot point, right?
The other thing is there may be mechanical devices there that aren't even necessarily IP enabled, but are similar in nature to very old school kind of technology like a modem or something
Field
to that
bus,
effect.
zero connectivity, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to find them. You know what I mean?
Talk to me after.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's
Yeah.
great. I would appreciate that if you could advise me. Thanks.
So let me add on to that a little bit. There's two things. Galina talked a lot about the technical aspects of that. One of the things that we're standing up in CISA right now is the National Risk Management Center. And they can help you to the second part of the question. Have I done enough?
Yeah.
What are the potential cascading effects if something goes bad and anhydrous ammonia is released? They can help you model that and understand some of the downstream effects and maybe even get you to an answer. Combined with what Galina has said, from a technical perspective, from a broader perspective, have I done enough to defend myself?
Okay. I'll catch up with you after. Thank you.
We're going to go over to the right, then we'll back over here at Joe.
Yeah.
Hi. My question is for the government side, actually. If right now, when we see what's happening in California just passed a law for IoT security, making some requirements on device manufacturers. I'm really confused to not see more action on the law and the government using a stick to force the manufacturers to do things, because the manufacturer community seems to be okay with being regulated on this front, as far as I can hear. But I don't see much movement in Washington. So, not to be cynical about, I don't want to go into the cynical, but is there an opposition to regulation in general for IoT security? Thank you.
Well, I won't get too deeply into that because it's outside of my window of expertise, but I will tell you that in general, just think about the status in Washington now, and as it has been for the past 20 years, there's a general reluctance to regulate. There, in the early 80s, the Congress built some steps into the process that require a cost-benefit analysis for every regulation. What's it going to cost? So, yeah, while you might think that regulation is the answer, there's got to be more to it than just regulation, because regulation in some cases is very effective, in other cases, maybe not.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. It's not the whole equation and the whole solution, but it's completely absent now.
I wouldn't say it's absent. I think take a look at what the FDA does with medical devices. There's regulation there. Like I said, you can't do a patch on a medical device without having the OEM do it. So there's a regulatory impact right there. So, I realize that's a less filling answer than you'd like. It's got great taste, but it doesn't. Sorry.
All right, we're going to move over here to Joe.
Yeah. I just have a couple of comments, really more than questions. I happen to be the managing director of ISA 99, which is Control System Cybersecurity. And I've got a database. There's already been more than 1,000 deaths to date. And when you brought up X-ray machines, yes, control system cyber has actually caused deaths from X-ray machines already. So part of what I'm now also saying, we don't have control system cyber forensics when you get below the IP layer. We have really no training of engineers to be able to look and say, can that have been cyber? Okay? But the other point is, everything here has been discussions about OT networks. Control systems start with sensors, actuators, and drives. We have no cybersecurity, authentication, or ability to know if the sensors are even correct today. And that also means all of the vulnerability disclosures and vulnerability assessment methodology makes absolutely no sense at this level because there's no security. So you can't do a gap analysis when there's nothing. And this is part of what we're trying to understand. Because if you can't trust your measurements, you can't be secure.
Thank you, Joe. Last question?
Thank you for the panel. It was really great. I'm a student at UC Berkeley, and I'm working with utility companies like the ones you mentioned, which are small and municipal. And one of the things we're trying to do is to help them make data-driven decision making. And what we realized in the process is that a lot of them have the data, and it's not on a central cloud or a server or something. It's just in their siloed systems. And as we try to unite that into a particular area where you mentioned the confluence of IT and OT, to get the latest algorithms for machine learning and data visualization, you generally look towards the cloud. And if you move towards the cloud, you open yourself up to newer attacks. Now, where does the balance lie between moving certain parts to the cloud and keeping certain parts local, and can CISA help in that?
That's you.
I could answer that question for hours, but it's a cost-benefit analysis. Again, I think part of what we're paying in terms of all of those challenges that we have in IT-OT convergence is that we took the benefits from having the data and the business analytics in the OT networks, but we didn't really think about how to separate the two and how to contain them. So I would say the math and the logic would be very different for a large utility compared to a smaller one. Really, there's no generic way in which I could answer that question. It comes down to the business impact and what makes sense for you, but you cannot just ignore the cost side of the equation and not put any security in place, because then we have what we have today.
Everyone, thank you very much for attending, and thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.